"You're too old to be on this stage, ma'am. Please step aside." Those were the words that tried to dismiss her. But what followed silenced an entire room. When an elderly woman named Adeline Turner was publicly mocked at a prestigious music showcase, no one expected what would happen next. Asked to play an out-of-tune piano as a joke, she sat, closed her eyes, and awakened decades of buried brilliance. Her hands, weathered by time but led by memory, played a piece so powerful it shook an entire generation of musicians. But that was only the beginning, because what Adeline did that night wasn't just reclaim her place, it transformed the way we understand genius, art, and truth forever. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now let's get back to the story. You can't be serious. This showcase is for students, not seniors. The words struck like a cymbal crash, sharp, dismissive, echoing through the marbled lobby of the Hamilton Conservatory. Miss Adeline stood just past the polished brass doors, her small leather music case clutched to her chest. The usher, a young man no older than 25, leaned in with that kind of forced politeness reserved for the elderly when they're assumed confused. "I'm not lost," she replied quietly, her voice like worn velvet. "I was invited." The usher looked her up and down, her sensible shoes, her worn olive coat, the soft lines of her face telling 1,000 sunrises more than any of the glittering guests around her. "By who?" he asked, skeptical. Behind her, the line of glittering attendees, students, instructors, donors, grew restless. "By Daniel Hawk," she said. The name stilled the air. A few heads turned. Daniel Hawk, the prodigy pianist, the conservatory's golden boy, the headline of tonight's student gala. The usher faltered, then shook his head. "Even so, ma'am, this evening is for young performers, alumni, faculty, not accompaniment." That word hung heavy. Adeline felt it in her chest. Accompaniment. Background music. A relic, not a performer. She looked past the usher into the glittering auditorium where the stage gleamed under soft blue lights. She could almost feel the vibration of the keys beneath her fingertips. "I used to teach Daniel," she said simply. "I didn't come here to be seen. I came to listen. Maybe to play, if I'm allowed." Laughter burst out from nearby, a young man in a velvet blazer, no more than 20, sneering as he adjusted his cufflinks. "She taught Daniel Hawk? What's next? She mentored Mozart too." The chuckles rippled through the cluster of stylish students behind him. Adeline's jaw tightened. She glanced down at her hands, wrinkled, lined, but steady. Hands that had once been praised by church choirs, jazz legends, conservatory scouts. Hands that had held her baby and a piano's secrets all at once. "I suppose if no one believes me," she murmured, "then I'll just be on my way." But as she turned, a voice called out from deeper inside the auditorium. "Wait." It was a man's voice. Rich, calm, and familiar. From behind the curtain at the side of the stage emerged a silver-haired professor with square glasses and a posture too proper to ever truly soften. Professor Elgin, the conservatory's head judge tonight, his sharp eyes narrowed as they fell on her, and a slow smirk curled the edge of his mouth. Well, if it isn't the elusive Miss Turner," he said. "I thought you'd finally given up on these places." A few students turned to look at one another, unsure if this was a joke. Adeline's gaze met his. "I came to see how your new generation plays," she replied evenly. "But it seems I've walked into something else entirely." Elgin chuckled, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Oh, you walked into exactly the right room. In fact, since you're here, and since you claim to have taught young Mr. Hawk, why don't you give us a taste?" The usher blinked. "Sir, I don't think." Elgin waved a hand. "Bring the practice piano. Let's see what the past can offer the future." The students gasped. A girl in a red dress whispered, "She's going to humiliate herself." Someone else hissed, "He's setting her up." Because they all knew what he meant. Not the glossy Steinway center stage, but the dusty upright practice piano in the corner. Out of tune, missing an E key, used only for warm-ups and punishments. And tonight, it would be a stage for mockery. The ushers rolled it in like wheeling out a sacrifice. It groaned under its own weight, splintered at the legs. Adeline walked slowly, gracefully, as though she hadn't heard the giggles. She placed her bag down gently on the floor beside the bench, opened it, and pulled out a soft cloth. With the reverence of a ritual, she wiped down the keys. Her glasses came next. She set them on the bridge of her nose, squinting at the dusty ivory. One key had a faded sticker with a smiley face, a child's leftover. Another was cracked in two. Still, she didn't complain. She sat. The crowd murmured. Phones came out. A few students in the front row whispered bets. How many notes before she stops, before she forgets? And for a moment, she didn't move. She just sat. Eyes closed, hands still, back straight. A clock ticked somewhere. The hush thickened. Someone in the back cleared their throat awkwardly. Was she frozen? Was she asleep? She doesn't remember how to play, a boy chuckled under his breath. But then, her left hand lifted. It hovered above the lowest note and pressed. A single tone, rich and deep, rippled across the room. It vibrated through the audience, not just a note, but a memory made flesh, a sound like something waking up. Then came the second note, played with her right hand in a higher octave. Then a third, building slowly into a phrase. She wasn't playing a song yet. She was sculpting silence. A quiet rhythm emerged, hesitant, searching, as if the piano itself needed convincing. She pressed harder, coaxed it, urged it to breathe. Chords began to blossom, lush, aching harmonies threaded through trembling trills. The laughter stopped. The whispers died. The young man who bet she wouldn't last 30 seconds had forgotten to breathe. Adeline leaned forward. Her fingers moved with growing confidence. A left-hand rhythm, syncopated and sure. A right-hand melody, soulful, rising like smoke from a chimney. Blues crept into the classical phrasing. Jazz flickered in the minor turns. The keys obeyed, not begrudgingly, but as if they remembered her. As if this wasn't a mockery. As if it was a requiem, an invocation, something sacred that had been sleeping and was only now beginning to stretch its limbs in front of a crowd too young to know what they'd almost missed. Adeline's body remained still, but her hands spoke in tongues. Her left hand carried weight, the grounding force of rhythm and memory, while her right hand soared, dancing along the upper registers with fluttering arpeggios, broken chords, and aching dissonance that somehow resolved themselves in the most unexpected but satisfying ways. A note cracked under her touch. The old piano was buckling from its own history, but Adeline adjusted in real time, sliding into a minor key, turning a broken note into a purposeful silence, using absence like a brushstroke. Those who had gathered to laugh now leaned in, chins resting in palms, eyes wide and glassy. A girl in the third row, Olivia, a scholarship student from Atlanta, had studied under 4 of the conservatory's best pianists, but never, not once, had she seen anyone talk through the keys the way Adeline was. She didn't read sheet music. She didn't glance at a metronome. And yet, every beat fell with the inevitability of rain on an empty rooftop. The music was unlike anything taught in their classrooms. It didn't follow strict European structures. It meandered like river water, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always flowing from something deeper than paper could chart. It was pain and celebration, oppression and liberation, longing and peace. And somewhere between the 34th and 35th measure, the mood in the room shifted from curiosity to reverence. Professor Elgin, who had initially smirked when he suggested the performance, found his throat tight. His arms were crossed, but not in judgment anymore, more like someone trying to hold in an emotion they didn't want the world to see. He wasn't the only one. The velvet-jacketed boy who had chuckled earlier was now frowning, but not out of malice. His fingers twitched in his lap, as if unconsciously trying to follow her phrasing. He didn't understand how she was modulating so seamlessly, blending minor sevenths with suspended chords like a whispered confession. Behind him, a donor whispered to her husband, "Is this an original composition?" "It must be," he whispered back. "I've never heard anything like it. Have you?" The woman shook her head slowly, unable to tear her gaze from the stage. What none of them knew, what Adeline had never said aloud, was that this piece had no name. It had no score. It had been written in the back of her mind over the course of 6 decades, stitched together during stolen moments. When her newborn son had colic and she'd rocked him by moonlight, humming chord progressions into his tiny ear. When her husband had come home from working the night shift, exhausted and beaten by the world, and she'd played for him instead of saying all the words she didn't know how to voice. When segregation had kept her from sitting in a recital hall, she'd waited outside with a notebook, composing harmonies from memory. All of that had lived in her hands. dormant. And now, in front of a room full of strangers who had dismissed her as too old, the music came alive. The tension that once hovered like a cruel joke was now something else entirely. Awe. At the edge of the room, Daniel Hawk, the golden boy himself, had just arrived. He entered quietly, almost late, walking in mid-piece. He paused just inside the door as the sound washed over him, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply watched. Adeline's eyes were still closed. She could feel the heat of the stage lights on her face, the way the broken E-key offered resistance before surrendering. She was somewhere else. Somewhere far from this glittering room. She was 10 again, sitting on an old church bench in Mississippi, playing on a piano with 3 missing pedals, her grandmother watching proudly from the back pew. That memory rose in her chest like warmth, and with it, she shifted the rhythm slightly, infusing the piece with a gospel cadence, a subtle swing that made the floor beneath the audience feel like it was moving. Somewhere, a student sniffled and wiped his eyes. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't sadness, not entirely. It was recognition of something lost, something his professors hadn't taught him how to name. The piece swelled. Her fingers danced now, faster, brighter, as if each note was a firefly released from a jar. The old piano, though battered and bruised, answered her with trembling resolve. It wanted to give her this moment. It had to. And then, like a prayer nearing its final amen, the music began to slow. Adeline brought the tempo down gently, like lowering a child into sleep, one last chord. Then silence. Not abrupt silence, but sacred, holding silence. The kind that exists just after revelation. No one clapped. Not yet. No one dared. They stared, as if unsure whether it had really happened. Adeline opened her eyes. The lights blurred slightly in her vision. She took a breath, and then, slowly, a sound rose. A single clap. From Olivia, the girl in the 3rd row, then another, and another, until the room thundered in applause. But the loudest sound in the room wasn't the clapping. It was the absence of doubt. She stood, her body straight and proud. No dramatic bow, no flourish, just a quiet nod. In the back of the room, Daniel stepped forward. His voice cracked slightly, but he called out, "That's my teacher." The room turned. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Adeline looked at him, the corners of her mouth lifting with a kind of pride that needed no explanation. She had played for herself, but now they had all heard what the world had missed. And the awakening had only just begun. The applause poured down like warm summer rain, thundering through the velvet-lined walls of the conservatory hall. And yet Adeline Turner stood motionless. Not because she was overwhelmed, not because she needed time to collect herself, but because for the first time in decades, she could feel the full weight of silence after the music. And not the silence of dismissal, but the kind that blooms only after something holy has passed through a room. Her fingers, still hovering slightly above the keys, trembled, not from age, but from reverence. The piano, for all its cracks and weary bones, had become a sacred witness, and every soul in the auditorium knew it. She didn't bow, she didn't curtsy. Instead, she slowly removed her glasses and folded them into the pocket of her coat, the way someone might gently close the pages of a letter from a lost love. Then she turned toward the audience. And there, standing near the center aisle, Daniel Hawk, the very name that had sold out this student showcase, was clapping the hardest of them all. His eyes glistened. "That's my teacher," he said again. Louder now. His voice didn't shake this time. It rose with a steady weight, anchoring the moment. "You're all trying to be what she already is." A collective hush fell again, not out of confusion, but revelation. Several heads turned to stare at him, blinking as if seeing him for the first time, not as a prodigy or a poster boy, but as a student. A vessel molded by someone they had just laughed at minutes earlier. Adeline didn't react with triumph. She simply gave a tiny nod, her expression unreadable but glowing with something deeper than pride. And then she walked off the stage. As she passed the front row, students moved their knees and clutched at their programs nervously, as if being near her was suddenly like sitting beside history in motion. A few reached out impulsively to shake her hand, but hesitated, unsure if they were worthy. But Olivia, the girl who clapped first, stood and stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said softly, "can I ask you, what was that piece?" Adeline smiled, her voice a soft balm. "It doesn't have a name. It's pieces of pieces. Old songs I never finished, some notes from dreams, a little of my grandmother, a little of my son. Olivia blinked. You composed that? No, she said gently. I lived that. And then she walked past them, the way a wave recedes quietly after it's crashed into the shore and changed the sand forever. Professor Elgin stood at the far end of the hall, arms still folded, but his posture had shifted. Something about the way his eyes followed Adeline's steps revealed that he was no longer amused, no longer controlling the narrative. He had just watched something he couldn't explain, and he knew it. As Adeline approached him, he straightened his back, clearing his throat. Miss Turner, he said carefully, like someone tasting a word they hadn't dared utter in years. She tilted her head. Professor Elgin? You've evolved, he said. No, she replied, not unkindly. You just finally listened. There was no venom in her voice, only truth. Behind them, the students had begun talking again, but this time in hushed tones, not gossip. Reverence. The kind of low rumble that follows the sighting of a comet or an eclipse. Phones were being put away now, videos saved not to mock, but to preserve. Daniel made his way through the rows, his expensive shoes echoing on the wood floor. When he reached her, he opened his arms awkwardly, like a child again. She hugged him, brief and firm, her hand resting behind his shoulder, like she had when he was just 12 years old, and cried after missing a single note during his first recital. I told them about you, he said into her ear. Years ago. I tried, but nobody listens to stories that don't come with shiny credentials. Adeline pulled back slightly and looked him in the eye. They listened tonight, and he nodded, almost tearfully. Just then, the doors at the back of the auditorium swung open, and a young event organizer in a headset bustled in, eyes wide and frantic, breathless from some backstage emergency. We need to reshuffle the set list, she said aloud to one of the assistants. Everyone's asking if the lady's performing again. Some are saying she's the real headliner. The assistant blinked. She's not on the program. She is now, the organizer replied. Professor Elgin overheard. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't protest. He knew the tide had changed. Suddenly, one of the donors, an older woman in pearls, approached Adeline with cautious admiration. That was magnificent, she said. You should be on the board, or at least teaching here. The students need you. Adeline gave a soft laugh. They don't need me, she said. They need to remember why they started playing in the first place. Before the medals, before the critics, before the applause. Her eyes traveled over the room again, landing briefly on the battered piano. Most of them have never been told their music matters unless it sounds perfect. I was told my music didn't matter because it came from me. The donor tilted her head, unsure. What do you mean? Adeline's gaze didn't waver. I mean, I grew up in a time when certain fingers weren't welcome on ivory keys. The words hung there. Quiet. Devastating. True. And the donor understood. Finally. Daniel spoke gently. Come with me. I want you to see something. She followed him down the back hallway of the conservatory, past locked classrooms and practice rooms where future stars were born in private struggle. He stopped before a tall, dusty cabinet tucked beneath the stairwell. Inside was an old photo, a black and white image of a community church music group from the 1960s. He pointed to a girl sitting front and center, her hands on the piano keys. I found this a year ago in an archive, he said. That's you, isn't it? Adeline smiled faintly. It was. He opened the cabinet and carefully removed the photo, holding it as if it were scripture. Tonight, you reminded me why I started playing, he said quietly. Not for spotlights, not for scholarships, but because I wanted to tell stories like yours. Adeline's throat tightened. For years, she had taught students in her modest apartment, charging almost nothing. She'd baked cookies for their lessons, bought them sheet music when their parents couldn't. Many went on to become good musicians, but only a few ever became true listeners. Daniel, for all his fame, had never stopped being one. A moment later, the event organizer returned. Miss Turner, would you consider returning to the stage? We'd like to add you to the finale lineup, even just one more piece. Adeline considered the request. She looked back down the hallway toward the grand auditorium that once dismissed her as a relic. She could still hear the echoes of her own chords hanging in the walls, and then, slowly, she nodded. I'll play, she said. But only if the youngest student joins me. They blinked. "Who's the youngest?" the organizer asked, scrambling with her clipboard. Daniel grinned. "Olivia, the girl who stood first." Adeline turned to Daniel. "Then tell her to meet me at the piano. It's time someone else begins their story where I nearly ended mine." And with that, she stepped back into the light. The house lights dimmed once more. But this time the hush that settled over the auditorium wasn't laced with cynicism or smug expectation. It was reverent, holy. Like the moment before communion, or the breath held just before a vow is spoken. Students who had earlier slouched in seats now sat forward with notebooks pressed against their knees, fingers trembling to capture something, anything, from this night that might one day explain why it changed them. The battered upright piano was gone. In its place, at the center of the stage, gleamed the polished Steinway concert grand, its ebony surface reflecting the soft golden spotlights that now pooled over it like honey. It was the kind of instrument that had only ever bowed to prodigies, men in tuxedos, women with names etched on album covers. Tonight, it would listen to history. Adeline Turner stepped into the light with the calm poise of a woman who had nothing left to prove and everything left to give. Her olive coat had been exchanged for a simple charcoal shawl, her silver hair softly pinned but otherwise unchanged, unadorned. Her presence was the adornment. Her walk carried the tempo of someone who knew every board beneath her feet, even if they'd once tried to push her off the stage. The audience stirred as a second figure emerged, Olivia. Nervous, wide-eyed, a little breathless, the young girl followed behind, cradling a folder of notes to her chest as if it might shield her from the magnitude of what she was stepping into. Her black curls framed her face like a storm of questions, but her steps matched Adeline's exactly. Measured, slow, steady. She looked at the grand piano as if it might eat her. Adeline noticed. She reached out, gently resting a hand on Olivia's shoulder, and bent slightly to whisper just loud enough for the front row to hear. "Don't fear the keys. They're just bones waiting for you to give them flesh." Olivia blinked up at her. "What if I mess up?" Adeline smiled. "Then you'll play something real." The crowd didn't hear that second part, but they felt it, somehow, in the way Olivia breathed out and let her shoulders fall. Adeline took her place on the left side of the bench. Olivia hesitated, then sat on the right. Two worlds. Two generations. Two stories told in silence before a single note was even played. Adeline didn't look at the sheet music. She didn't need to. She tapped a slow rhythm on her thigh with two fingers, then nodded once. And then, together, they began. The first few measures were simple, a lilting melody that rocked like a lullaby from another century. Olivia's fingers fumbled the first chord, just slightly. The audience held its collective breath. But Adeline didn't correct her. She adjusted, shifted the harmony, covered the falter like a mother steadying a child's first dance step. They continued. Four hands now spoke in one language, not in unison but in conversation. Olivia brought brightness, eager and rising, while Adeline anchored the flow, weaving a deeper resonance beneath every chord the young girl touched. It was like watching dawn and dusk play a duet, light folding into wisdom, daybreak meeting memory. As they reached the second movement, the melody began to open wider, expanding into more intricate phrasing. Olivia hesitated only once, unsure of a modulation. Adeline gently nudged it forward with a single upward glissando, barely noticeable, but Olivia caught it, her eyes flicking sideways, her lips parting in a tiny gasp of realization. They smiled, just for a moment, as if to say, "Yes, this is music." In the audience, students were crying openly now. Some held hands. One violinist gripped her instrument case to her chest, as if she'd just remembered why she fell in love with music in the first place. Professor Elgin remained standing in the back, arms still crossed, but now humbled into stillness, his jaw slack. The boy in the velvet blazer had taken out his phone, but not to record, just to write down a name in his notes. Adeline Turner. Underlined twice. Halfway through the piece, Adeline paused her left hand entirely, letting Olivia carry the melody alone. It was terrifying. The room felt it. Olivia felt it. Her fingers trembled. But Adeline whispered, "Trust yourself." And Olivia did. She played, softly at first, then with conviction. The notes rose like lanterns, imperfect, glorious, honest. And then, just as the crowd was sure the piece had reached its peak, Adeline returned, gently, seamlessly. Her left hand re-entered with a quiet progression, supporting the soaring upper melody like the ground rejoining the feet of someone who had just dared to leap. The room erupted into something wordless. Not applause, not noise, just presence. Every soul in that room was present. The final chord came like dusk settling into evening, not crashing but resting, like a final exhale after a story well told. And then the silence returned. Not the silence of dismissal, not the silence of confusion, but the sacred hush of transformation. Adeline and Olivia held their fingers over the keys for a few extra seconds, honoring what had just been released. Then, slowly, they lowered their hands. The crowd didn't wait this time. They leapt to their feet. Tears, cheers, gasps. Some shouted her name. Adeline, Adeline, though many had only learned it an hour ago. Olivia looked overwhelmed. Adeline reached over and took her hand, raising it high like a champion. Then she pulled her close and whispered something into her ear. Later, when asked what Adeline said, Olivia would reply, "She told me the piano remembers, and now, so do they." From that night forward, Olivia's life changed, not because she played beside a legend, but because a legend believed in her before she believed in herself. And Adeline? She didn't ask for anything. No title, no award, no compensation. Only this, that every student in that room promised to remember that music is not a contest. It is not a commodity. It is not a thing to be won. It is breath. It is memory. It is love passed between trembling hands across generations. That night, no one left unchanged. And the piano? It didn't sleep again for weeks. While the ovation rolled on, the applause had become more than noise. It was grief released. It was gratitude long overdue. A tide of buried emotions now flowing freely through young hands and old hearts alike. But not everyone was on their feet. In the back row of the auditorium, seated like a shadow behind the awe, was a man with his arms resting heavily on the arms of his chair. His name was Robert Kingsley. He was the head judge, the founding donor, and the silent authority whose word often decided the course of a student's entire career. While the rest of the audience celebrated, his hands gripped the polished ends of the chair, unmoving. His eyes were wide, not in wonder, but in memory. He had not clapped once. Not out of arrogance, not even disbelief, but because he had seen a ghost, Adeline Turner. That name, that face, those fingers, they didn't belong in his present. They belonged to a night he had buried 56 years ago, a night when he had been 10 years old, dressed in too small clothes, hiding in the back pew of a southern church he wasn't supposed to enter. She had been there, on a battered upright just like tonight, but younger, glowing with the kind of joy that only happens when sound becomes salvation. He remembered how her music had stopped him from running, how it had made him sit cross-legged on the wooden floor, afraid even to breathe. He had wanted to speak to her after, to say thank you, but his father had found him and dragged him out by the ear. "You do not speak to their kind," he had hissed through clenched teeth, "especially not ones with talent." That night had changed something in him. But it wasn't until today that he realized how much. He stared now, as the lights above the stage softened and Adeline stood side by side with Olivia, both hands raised in silent farewell. The applause still thundered. But Robert Kingsley sat frozen in a silence of his own making. It wasn't shame exactly. It was something colder, regret, and something inside him, a wall built so long ago, began to crack. Adeline's eyes scanned the crowd, and she saw him, sitting, stone still. She didn't blink, didn't smile, but her gaze didn't move for several seconds, holding him in a moment that felt like a mirror he hadn't asked for. Then she looked away. The students began to gather at the edge of the stage, rushing forward with programs, pens, and wide, pleading eyes. Some wanted autographs. Others just wanted to touch her hand, as if proximity to her might awaken something inside themselves. She gave what she could. Soft smiles, warm handshakes, a few notes of encouragement scrawled on programs. One young man, tall and stiff in posture, stood back until the crowd thinned. He stepped forward with a small, cloth-bound journal in his hands. "I don't want a signature," he said, nervous but firm. "I want to give you something." Adeline took the journal and looked down. Her breath caught in her throat. On the first page was a pencil sketch of her, playing the upright from earlier that evening. The detail was staggering, every wrinkle in her knuckles, the fragile curve of her back, even the faint smile on her lips as she struck the keys. I started drawing while you played, he whispered. I didn't even realize I was doing it. It's like you pulled it out of me. Adeline opened the second page. Another sketch. Olivia mid-note, eyebrows furrowed in concentration. I've never drawn like this before, he continued. I was going to drop out. I didn't think I belonged here. But tonight, Adeline reached out and placed a hand gently on his cheek. You do, she said, voice like a distant hymn. And you always did. You just needed someone to remind you. As he turned away, wiping his eyes, Daniel approached with Professor Elgin behind him. Elgin no longer carried the air of superiority. He walked slowly now, like a man realizing he had been standing at the edge of a forest, unaware of the symphony it carried until someone struck a match and lit the path. Miss Turner, Elgin said quietly, I owe you more than I can say. She regarded him kindly, but not without distance. Words are easy, Professor. I know, he nodded. That's why I'm not offering them. He handed her an envelope. Inside it wasn't money, it wasn't a certificate, it was a letter, with the conservatory's seal, a contract, an offer of appointment, honorary faculty, lifetime guest artist, full access to studio space, mentorship opportunities, student workshops, and, if she desired, performance recitals. Adeline read the first few lines. Then she looked up. You're offering me what should have been mine 60 years ago. Elgin swallowed. Yes. Adeline closed the envelope gently. And I'll accept. Not for me, but for the girl who still thinks she doesn't belong. The one who's sitting in the back, writing music in the margins of her notebook, wondering if the sound in her heart is worth sharing. She turned to Daniel. You teach now? I do, he nodded. Good. Then teach them that what they have is not theirs to hoard. Genius means nothing without generosity. He nodded again, deeply moved. The overhead lights began to dim as the custodians started their quiet work, stacking programs, sweeping beneath the seats. But one light remained, a small, focused beam still glowing over the Steinway. Adeline walked back toward it, alone now. No crowd, no student, no Olivia, just the stage and the piano. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a tiny folded piece of paper, yellowed with time, edges frayed. She unfolded it slowly, laying it across the music stand. It was a melody she had written in 1959, never finished, just a few bars. Her grandmother had hummed it while shelling peas in the kitchen. Her mother sang it through tears the day she buried her husband. And now Adeline had brought it here. She sat one last time, no fanfare, no applause, and she played it. Not loud, not long, just a few notes. Soft as a promise, gentle as dawn. The sound drifted out into the empty hall and then vanished into the air like smoke from a candle. She stood, left the music behind, and walked quietly into the wings. But even after she was gone, the melody stayed. Not just in the hall, but in them all. In the days that followed, the echoes of Adeline's music refused to fade. The students spoke of nothing else. Not the gala, not the visiting professors, not even Daniel Hawk's upcoming tour. Conversations shifted in hallways and practice rooms. Tone softened, pace slowed. It was as if the entire conservatory had been tuned by a different hand. One by one, professors began using her name in their lectures. As Miss Turner demonstrated, they'd say, as if she had always been part of the curriculum, a cornerstone they had simply forgotten to mention until now. Her phrases were studied, dissected. That impromptu duet with Olivia, transcribed from memory, played again and again in classrooms until students could internalize the phrasing, not just the notes, but the breath between them. In one corner of the library, a new section appeared. Turner Archives. No announcement, no fanfare. Just a handwritten label and a stack of journals donated by former students who remembered her home piano, her fresh lemon cake, her whispered encouragements over cracked metronomes and secondhand sheet music. But it wasn't just the conservatory that changed. Adeline Turner's name, once forgotten by the world outside those walls, was whispered far beyond them now. A video, grainy but powerful, had made its way online. The footage of her performance, of the moment she and Olivia shared the stage, was posted by a sophomore cellist who hadn't even meant to capture anything special. And yet, within hours, the internet disagreed. By the end of the week, the video had reached 1 million views. By the second week, it was everywhere. They called her too old, then she played. The woman who reminded us why we fell in love with music. This performance just redefined classical education. News stations reached out. Interview requests poured in. Major networks wanted exclusives. A producer offered to option her story for a documentary, possibly even a film. Awards committees sent letters of retroactive recognition. But Adeline, true to herself, answered most inquiries with one line. "I've already said what I needed to say. You just hadn't heard it before." And still, even as her name rippled across screens and stages, she didn't chase it. She returned to her quiet apartment above the old bakery on Ellington Avenue. Her cat, Miss Bessie, greeted her with a haughty glance, more annoyed at her absence than impressed by her global fame. She placed the letter from the conservatory's dean, sealed with an embossed crest, on her kitchen counter next to a bag of jasmine rice. She would answer it soon. Not now. Right now, she had music to write, not for anyone, just for herself. But in the world outside, her music had already started to seed something deeper. At the conservatory's next board meeting, there was an unusual motion on the agenda, proposed by Daniel Hawk himself. It was simple, but bold. "I propose the establishment of the Adeline Turner Fellowship for musicians over the age of 60, for those who've been told it's too late." There was silence at first. Then someone laughed, a cautious, uncomfortable chuckle from a man in a navy suit. "Daniel, with all due respect, do we really think there's a demand for that? Most artists over 60 aren't looking to start. They're slowing down." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "No, they're finally ready. Most just never had the chance." He glanced down at the document in front of him, then back up. Adeline didn't slow down. She was locked out. "We opened the wrong doors for the wrong people for too long. It's time we corrected that." The vote passed, not unanimously, but loudly. And with that, something changed, not just in policy but in spirit. Applications flooded in within weeks. A 72-year-old cab driver from Detroit who'd composed songs on his dashboard. A 68-year-old grandmother in Georgia who'd taught herself piano from YouTube and composed gospel chorales in her basement. A 64-year-old retired janitor from New York who had once played in a jazz trio under a different name, until his fingers were broken during a hate crime. They all wrote one sentence in their applications that repeated like a mantra. "I saw Adeline Turner play, and I remembered who I used to be." Back at the conservatory, Olivia became a symbol too, not just of youthful promise, but of how quickly change could take root when someone is believed in early. She was offered a mentorship under Adeline herself, and once a week, she took the bus to that little apartment over the bakery. She arrived with questions, notebooks, too many pencils, and too much self-doubt. She left with trembling fingers and a chest full of fire. Adeline never coddled her. "You're not playing to be impressive," she would say. "You're playing to be true. You want applause? Join a circus. You want truth? Let your scars play." One day, Olivia showed up with a bruised ego and sore hands. "I messed up at studio today," she said, slamming her backpack down. "I forgot the bridge. I cracked 3 notes, everyone stared." Adeline placed a kettle on the stove. "Good," she said. "Good." Olivia frowned. "It means you were trying something new. If no one stared, you weren't being honest enough." "But they laughed," Olivia whispered. Adeline poured hot water over a sachet of hibiscus tea. "They laughed at me too," she said. "Until they didn't." Outside the window, the wind tugged at the branches of a sycamore tree. Inside, silence returned, soft and instructive. And then Olivia said, "Will you play with me again?" Adeline smiled. "Only if you lead this time." So Olivia sat at the small upright by the window, took a breath, and began. And as her fingers found the first chords, strong and tentative all at once, Adeline closed her eyes. It was happening again. A new voice. The same music. Passed down like prayer. Winter came early that year. The first snow dusted the conservatory gardens in late October, wrapping the statues of composers and donors in quiet white robes as though the world itself had paused to take a breath. Inside the practice rooms, something deeper than cold had settled. A hush, a listening. It wasn't silence exactly. It was reverence. The kind that comes when a place has witnessed something sacred and doesn't want to forget. Adeline Turner hadn't returned to the stage again. She didn't need to. Her presence lingered in the keys themselves. Each time a student touched the Steinway in the concert hall, they did so with different hands, slower, gentler, not out of fear, out of honor. There were new rules now, unwritten ones. If you entered the recital hall after hours, you played with the lights dimmed. If someone sat down at the old practice upright in the corner, you gave them the room. And if anyone ever mentioned quitting, they were told, "Go find Adeline's melody. Then decide." And yet, it wasn't only musicians who found themselves drawn into her current. One morning, Olivia walked into the campus cafe and found 3 dancers huddled at a corner table watching a video on someone's phone. She recognized it instantly, her own duet with Adeline, now captioned in a dozen languages and stitched into inspiration reels on platforms neither she nor Adeline had ever used. "She makes me want to choreograph again," one dancer whispered. "I haven't moved like that since before the accident." A beat poet began hosting sessions in the lecture amphitheater, inviting students to bring instruments and blend spoken word with improvisational piano. A visual artist created a mural on the back wall of the east stairwell, painting Adeline not as a woman, but as hands turning into birds, keys turning into wings. One day, even the janitor, Mr. Charles, who'd worked the halls for 30 years, was caught humming her melody as he mopped the tile floors. The change was quiet, but undeniable. Meanwhile, in her apartment above the bakery, Adeline's life remained simple. She refused offers for studio recordings, declined television appearances. She didn't want to be branded or branded upon. "I've already been made into someone else before," she told Olivia one evening. "This time, I'll remain myself." But there was one offer she didn't refuse. A letter written not in printed ink, but in careful cursive. It was from a teacher in Memphis, a public school piano instructor. The envelope held a photograph of 22 children standing in front of a rusted upright, their smiles defiant despite missing keys and broken pedals. In the letter, the teacher explained that after watching Adeline's performance, she decided not to retire. Not yet. Not until every child in her class wrote their own composition, even if it was only 8 bars long. She asked if Adeline would consider visiting. Not for a concert, just for a conversation. Adeline folded the letter slowly and stared at it for a long time. Then she picked up the phone, dialed the number, and said softly, "Tell them to get that piano tuned. I'll be there." A week later, she stepped into that tiny school auditorium with a silk scarf wrapped around her neck and the same quiet fire in her eyes. She played no more than 3 pieces, short, unpolished ones. But the room hung on every note. She ended by playing the first 8 bars of her unnamed melody, then turned to the children and said, "Now, you finish it." The children did. Each of them. 1 bar at a time, 1 page at a time. Some scribbled clumsy lines with crayons. Others played timidly with 2 fingers. One boy wrote his on the back of his detention slip. And every week since, one of their melodies had arrived in Adeline's mailbox. She read them all. And she played each one. At night, in the quiet of her home with no audience but Miss Bessie curled up on the windowsill, she gave their sounds weight, gave their hopes volume, and wrote tiny notes on stationery. "Try repeating that ending. What would happen if you slowed down right before the 3rd note? You made me smile with that key change." She mailed the notes back without ceremony, but with something more valuable than praise: time. The most unexpected letter arrived in January. It came not from a child or a school or a composer, but from Robert Kingsley, the head judge, the man who had never stood. It was handwritten, not typed, and it began without greeting. "I remember you. I remember a church in the deep South. I remember sitting on the floor, hiding. I remember the sound of your playing, and I remember how it made me cry before I knew what sadness was. My father hit me for listening to you. But I kept hearing it, all my life. I let this school become something I thought was excellent, but it wasn't. It was safe, predictable, proud. You reminded me that excellence isn't precision, it's truth, and truth has no age. I am resigning. I hope that opens the door for more voices, especially the ones we didn't let in before. Thank you for not forgetting the music, even when we forgot you." Adeline read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and placed it beside the one from the Memphis children. Not because she forgave him, but because he had finally remembered. That spring, a new event was announced, the Turner Evening. It wasn't a gala, it wasn't a competition, it was a gathering. Students were invited to perform not their best pieces but their truest. No costumes, no elaborate staging, just raw music played by hearts in progress. No applause allowed between performances, only silence, the kind that listens. Adeline didn't attend the first Turner evening. She said it wasn't hers anymore. She stayed home and lit a candle, watched the moon rise, and waited. And when the video appeared online the next day, she clicked play. There, on screen, was Olivia. Sitting alone at the grand piano. She wasn't flawless. She missed 2 notes, but she didn't stop. And in the final moments, as the camera panned upward and caught her face in the stage light, Adeline saw something familiar. A look she had once worn. Not pride, not performance, but freedom. And she whispered to herself, "They've heard it now." Then she turned off the screen, opened her notebook, and began writing again. A new melody. It had no name yet, but it would. It was a warm April morning when the first letter arrived with no return address. The envelope was cream-colored, hand-addressed in careful block letters. Inside was a single sentence, scrawled in blue ink on unlined paper. "My mother gave up piano after my father left. She saw you play. Now she plays every morning." Adeline held it in her hand as sunlight pooled across the worn floorboards of her apartment. Outside, the city was waking. Delivery trucks rumbling along Ellington Avenue, church bells pealing 2 blocks over, the hum of life pushing forward as it always had. But inside her living room, the stillness deepened. She placed the letter in a carved wooden box on her bookshelf. Then she opened the window. She didn't expect the wind to carry her name the way it had. Didn't expect the melody from one night, one aching, trembling night, to seed itself across so many gardens. But it had. And the letters kept coming. Each one a small truth folded in paper. Some were stories. Some were fragments. Some were so raw she could barely read them aloud. A child in Belgium who had never spoken until she saw the piano. A 73-year-old woman in Arkansas who had pulled her grandmother's upright out of the barn after 40 years. A jazz trio in Harlem that now opened every set with a chord progression called Adeline's Wake. She read each letter slowly, patiently, reverently. And then one afternoon, a thin package arrived, no stamp, just hand-delivered to the bakery below her apartment. Inside was a notebook. The same kind she'd once gifted to Olivia. Its pages were filled not with music, but drawings. Dozens of them. All scenes from that first night, the battered upright, the stage lights, Olivia's trembling hands. One page showed Adeline's fingers not on keys, but pressed gently against a child's back, guiding them toward a bench. The drawings were unsigned, but a sticky note was affixed to the inside cover. It read, "I was the boy who drew you. I've applied to art school. I thought you should have the first thing that ever felt true." She closed the book slowly, holding it to her chest like a hymnal. Outside, the cherry blossoms were blooming, soft pink petals swirling through the breeze like music notes that had lost their staff lines, but not their meaning. Later that evening, Olivia arrived for her lesson, breathless and glowing. "I got in," she gasped, cheeks flushed. "To Juilliard. They offered me a partial scholarship and—" She paused, blinking. "They're naming one of the spring recitals after you." Adeline smiled, folding her hands in her lap. "Is that right? They want you to attend, maybe speak, play even if you feel up to it." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she motioned for Olivia to sit. "Do you know," Adeline said, "what I remember most from that night?" Olivia shook her head. "It wasn't the crowd, or the applause, or even the playing. It was when you missed that note, the way your hand hovered, the way you stayed." Olivia lowered her gaze. "I was terrified." "Exactly," Adeline whispered, "and you kept going." She rose, walked to the window, and gazed out at the city as if it were a score she could finally read after decades of silence. "That's what they're really asking you to do now. Keep going, even when it's terrifying, even when the keys feel too heavy or the world too loud. That's the work. That's the legacy." A pause. Then gently, "You don't need my name for that." But Olivia stepped forward, voice barely above a whisper. "I want it." And that was enough. 3 weeks later, Adeline stepped onto the stage at Juilliard, not to play, just to listen. Her chair was set stage left, slightly behind the grand piano. She wore a dark indigo dress and a silver scarf Olivia had given her, a soft wrap threaded with music notes stitched in black thread. She kept her hands folded in her lap as Olivia performed, note perfect, heart fierce, chin high. And when the last chord rang out, Adeline rose before the crowd could. She clapped once, then again, and the room followed her. Not because it was expected, but because they knew who had brought the fire. In the weeks after, she returned to her quiet life. The spotlight dimmed as quickly as it had flared, and she was grateful. Because real music isn't meant to blind, it's meant to warm. But something had changed. The conservatory invited her back, not to perform, but to listen, to guide. And once a month, she would arrive just before twilight, as the last of the sun slipped beneath the slate rooftops, and sit in a small side room they now called the listening room. Students would come in one by one, play their unfinished pieces, speak their doubts, cry sometimes, and she would sit. And after the music ended, after the silence had done its work, she would offer no corrections, no critiques, only questions. What were you trying to say? Where were you when you wrote that? Whose voice were you borrowing, and when did it become your own? It wasn't theory, it was excavation, and they left different, not perfect, but true. Then one evening, as May dissolved into June, Olivia came with something tucked under her arm. "I want you to have this," she said, handing over a thick, bound stack of paper. Adeline blinked. She opened it. A full composition, orchestral, dedicated. In 4 movements, the Turner Concerto. "I want the world to know," Olivia said, her voice trembling, "not just what you did for me, but what you gave to all of us." Adeline traced the notes slowly, as if they were braille, her fingers brushing over decades of silence finally transformed into sound. "You wrote me into the world," she whispered. "No," Olivia replied softly. "You wrote the world. I just gave it your name." That night, after Olivia left, Adeline sat at her upright, opened her notebook, and finished her unnamed melody. The one she had begun in 1959, the one she'd stitched through decades. She gave it a final chord, soft and unresolved, like a door left open just wide enough for someone else to walk through. And at the top of the page, in careful cursive, she finally wrote, "Adeline's Wake." She closed the notebook. The story wasn't over, but the silence it left behind was finally hers. The final movement was not a finale, it was a seed. Months passed. Seasons shifted like pages turning in a hymn book. Summer softened into gold, and autumn came wrapped in deep auburns and quiet winds. In the corner window of a small upstairs apartment above a bakery on Ellington Avenue, the curtain moved slightly with each breeze, as if the house itself was breathing in tempo. Inside, the piano sat by the bookshelf, its keys gently worn, like stones smoothed by the passing of time. Adeline didn't play as often now, not because her fingers couldn't, but because she no longer needed to prove that they could. She spent her mornings with tea and silence, not empty silence, but the kind she had once yearned for, earned silence. The hush of a life not unfinished, but full. Every few days, letters still arrived. Some addressed to her, others simply to the woman who reminded me I still could. She read each one slowly. Some she tucked into books, others she placed inside sheet music sleeves, as if they belonged there, among the notes. Her calendar remained spare, though there was always one appointment she never missed, the listening room. She didn't bring music, she didn't need a clipboard, just presence. One by one the students would come, some confident, some hollowed out by rejection or perfectionism, and she would listen. Not just with her ears, with her whole self. That was her gift. She had no desire to be remembered as the best pianist in the room, only the most honest listener. That September, a student named Clara came to see her. Clara was not a prodigy, not the best, not the fastest, but she had a soul threaded with quiet colors. She sat on the bench and said, "I wrote this after I found out my brother was sick." Adeline said nothing. Clara played. It was raw, uneven. The left hand stumbled more than once. The middle passage felt like it forgot itself halfway through and returned with its shirt on backward. But the melody, oh, the melody, it ached. It told the truth. It told of nights spent in hospitals, of hope shrinking in paper-thin folds, of love pressed between silences too large to speak. When Clara finished, she stared at her lap. "I know it's not good," she whispered. Adeline reached across the piano lid and placed a hand over Clara's. "Child," she said, "it is more than good." Clara looked up, eyes brimming. You remembered him. That's what the song had done. And that was all that mattered. Word of Adeline's sessions began spreading beyond the conservatory. Young musicians from other cities started arriving with folded music in trembling hands. They took long trains, buses, some hitchhiked. They brought compositions, yes, but more than that, they brought their stories. And Adeline listened. She didn't edit. She didn't fix. She helped them hear themselves. Her influence became less visible, but more permanent. It was in the way a young violinist closed her eyes before the final note, in the way a cellist paused, not to perfect, but to feel, in the way a boy in a jazz trio let the dissonance hang just long enough to mean something. One day, Olivia returned with news. "I've been asked to speak at a symposium in Berlin. They want me to talk about how you changed the definition of excellence." Adeline chuckled, her voice raspy with age and warmth. "You tell them I didn't change a thing. I just reminded them what it used to mean." She looked out the window as a flock of birds crossed the late afternoon sky, scattering like notes across a blank staff. "You're the echo now, Olivia. Make sure you don't return empty." Olivia nodded. Before she left, she leaned down and pressed her forehead to Adeline's gently. "I love you," Adeline smiled. "I know. Now go. Be loud." Weeks passed. Then one day Daniel arrived, unannounced. He looked older now, not in age but in bearing, softer around the eyes. A man who had unlearned the stage long enough to find his own humanity. He sat beside her on the couch. "You know," he said, "they're naming the new recital hall after you." Adeline raised a brow. "Oh? It's already been approved. The Turner Room. It'll be used only for original student work, no competitions. Just truth." She laughed softly. "Well, look at that. Took them long enough." He looked at her carefully. "You've built something that won't end with you." She didn't answer at first, then said quietly, "It never started with me." He tilted his head. "It started with my grandmother," she continued, singing to herself while washing clothes for other people's families. "With my mother, who saved for a whole year to buy me my first piano book. With a choir director who let me sneak into the building through the side door because they wouldn't let me in the front." She reached over and took Daniel's hand. "This was never about being seen. It was about seeing. And now, you all see each other better." He squeezed her hand gently. Before he left, he placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was a ticket, her name in gold letters. A seat reserved in the front row at the National Symphony's centennial celebration. They were playing a new piece, Awakening in G minor, composed by Daniel, dedicated to her. She didn't know if she would go. She didn't need the stage anymore. But that night, alone in her apartment, she played again. Softly, slowly. The melody had changed over time. But it was still hers. It always had been. The day arrived with no ceremony, no headlines, no fanfare, just a thin morning light slipping through the lace curtains of Adeline Turner's upstairs apartment, how bathing the wooden floors in gentle gold. The air carried the scent of old sheet music and fresh bread from the bakery below, and the hush in the room was not of waiting, but of peace. The piano sat closed, the stool slightly askew, as though she had just stepped away to make tea. But today, there was no tea brewing, no notebook open on the table, no pen, no marked measures in red ink, only a quiet, sacred stillness. The cat, Miss Bessie, curled on the windowsill as usual, watching the sky with that ancient feline stillness, as if she, too, was listening for something only she could hear. Olivia arrived just after 10. She didn't knock. She never had to. The door was always left open when she was expected, and today was no different. She slipped in with a stack of papers in one hand and a bag of honey cookies in the other. "Adeline," she called softly, "I brought the final arrangement. I think we finally figured out the third movement. Your idea about holding the pedal longer before the descent was perfect." Silence answered, but not the kind that made her worry, the kind that made her listen. She set the cookies on the counter, walked past the small bookshelf, past the chair by the window, until she reached the piano. Adeline sat in her chair, hands folded gently in her lap, eyes closed. Her face was still, but her spirit, Olivia could feel it, had already moved into the next song. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply dropped to her knees beside the chair, rested her head on Adeline's thigh, and whispered, "You finished it, didn't you?" The wind blew gently through the window, lifting a corner of the old music notebook on the table. The last page had a date written in ink, one day before. Beneath it, a single note, not a chord, not a phrase. Just one note. Drawn slow and deliberate, as if she had known it would be her last. But even that single note, hung with meaning, aching with restraint, said more than most symphonies ever could. Olivia stood, trembling, and reached for the small tape recorder Adeline kept by the piano, a habit from her early years. Sometimes when a melody came and she was too tired to write, she would hum into it, fingers tapping rhythms on the lid. Olivia pressed play. Nothing. Then a crackle. And Adeline's voice, soft, measured. If you're hearing this, it means I had enough time to say goodbye without needing to be in the room to do it. I don't need you to mourn. I need you to play. And I don't mean the clean version. Not the competition-ready, polished, perfect version. I mean the real one. The one that sounds like your heartbeat after you've just been told the truth. The one that feels like laughter in the middle of grief. The one that remembers the people no one else does. Don't let them turn your song into a product. Let it be a mirror, and when you feel afraid, when the stage feels too wide and the world too loud, remember me and remember this: you're not playing for anyone. You're playing with everything. The tape clicked saw at the end. Olivia didn't move, just breathed and knew. A week later, the world found out. The obituary was small, modest, just the way she would have wanted it. Adeline Grace Turner, 86, musician, teacher, listener. She woke the keys and threw them us, but the world didn't mourn quietly. Tributes began pouring in, not from celebrities, not from corporations or critics, but from children, from elders, from janitors and waitresses and farmers who had dusted off their memories and touched the keys again because of her. One school in Chicago held an all-night vigil with music and poetry in her honor. A pianist in Seoul played her unnamed melody at sunrise. A deaf dancer choreographed a performance to vibrations alone, naming it Adeline's Pulse. And in the conservatory that had once turned her away, the lights dimmed in the Turner room. Olivia stepped onto the stage alone, a single beam of amber light shining down on the grand piano. She didn't speak. She didn't bow. She just played. Not perfectly, but honestly. And when she finished, she left the bench exactly as it was, and walked off stage without waiting for applause, because that's how Adeline taught her to finish a story, not with noise, but with truth. That night, somewhere far from stages and lights and tributes, an old piano sat in a community church in Mississippi. It had 3 missing pedals and cracked middle C. A child climbed onto the bench, legs too short to reach the floor, and began to play something they couldn't quite explain. It wasn't familiar, and yet, it was. The congregation turned. The pastor smiled, because somehow they knew Adeline Turner had found her way home again. Not in body, but in sound. And sound, after all, is eternal. Sometimes the most extraordinary revolutions begin not with noise, but with quiet hands touching forgotten keys. Adeline Turner didn't storm stages or chase applause. She didn't shout for recognition or demand justice from a world that once ignored her brilliance. Instead, she played. She listened. She lived. Her story reminds us that it is never too late to be seen, never too late to awaken a song buried by years of doubt, silence, or dismissal. That age is not a limitation, it's a library. Every wrinkle, every tremble, every scar on her hands held more wisdom than 1,000 polished performances. She wasn't celebrated because she was perfect. She was remembered because she was true. In a world obsessed with speed, youth, and perfection, Adeline slowed the world down until we had no choice but to feel again. She taught us that music is not competition. It is not ego. It is memory, resistance, resilience, and most of all, presence. She didn't just play notes, she told stories. She let every key become a breath. And with each person she touched, whether a forgotten janitor, a nervous girl named Olivia, or a room full of cynics who rose to their feet in awe, she rewrote what excellence truly means. It's not about how many people know your name. It's about what people feel when they hear your truth. So whatever your craft may be, whatever song lives quietly inside your bones, let this be your sign. It's not too late. You're not too old. You're not too broken. You're not too late. The world needs your melody. Imperfect, trembling, breathtakingly real. And if you ever forget how to begin, just remember Adeline and play.